There are two moments that define a life Eleanor Ashworth would come to understand: the moment when hope dies, and the moment when it dares to breathe again. And she had lived through the first on a spring evening 3 years past, in a ballroom glittering with candlelight and cruelty, when Lord Clarence Pemberton had turned to his companion and spoken words that would echo through every sleepless night that followed. "One cannot blame a man for declining damaged goods. The face is pretty enough, but pretty does not pay creditors, and I have no interest in purchasing a pauper's gratitude." She had been standing close enough to hear every syllable, close enough to see the curl of his lip as he laughed, close enough to watch his pale blue eyes slide over her as though she had already ceased to exist, and the whispers had spread through Lady Hartwell's spring ball like fire through dry grass, consuming everything she had believed about love and worth, and the promises men made to women they claimed to admire. She had not wept, not there, not where they could see, but something had frozen inside her chest that night, something that had once been warm and hopeful and foolish enough to believe that a man's tender words meant tender intentions. Now, 3 years later, Eleanor sat in the shabby genteel sitting-room of the townhouse in an unfashionable corner of London, her chestnut hair pinned in its simple chignon, her grey-green eyes, the colour of a winter sea, her grandmother had once said, fixed on the window where grey clouds pressed against the glass like a promise of rain that never quite fell. The room bore the careful marks of genteel poverty, the carpet worn thin in paths between furniture, the drapes faded where sunlight had touched them summer after summer, the fire burning low because coal must be rationed now. Her mother, Lady Henrietta Ashworth, sat by the window with mending in her lap, her needle moving with determined cheerfulness through fabric that had already been mended twice before. "I believe we might manage quite well if we reduced the coal order by another quarter," her mother said, her voice bright in a way that made Eleanor's heart ache more than complaints ever could. "And Mrs. Cooper has been speaking of retiring to live with her sister in Hampshire, which would save her wages, though of course we shall miss her terribly." Eleanor murmured agreement, though they both knew Mrs. Cooper's retirement was less a choice than a gentle fiction to preserve everyone's dignity. When her mother excused herself to speak with the cook about economizing the week's menus, Eleanor remained alone by the window, watching the grey sky that seemed to mirror something inside her, suspended, waiting, neither weeping nor clearing. Her fingers rose without thought to touch the hollow of her throat, pressing gently against the pulse that proved she was still alive, still breathing, still enduring. She had made peace with her fate, she told herself. She did not hope, she did not dream. She was content with survival, with the quiet dignity of reduced circumstances, with the small mercy of having her mother's company, and a roof that remained, for now, their own. Her other hand found the delicate gold locket at her throat, her grandmother's portrait inside, the only treasure she had kept, because it held no value anyone could measure in pounds. But contentment, she knew in the silence of that grey afternoon, was not the same as happiness, and the woman she had been at 21, bright with possibility and foolish with hope, had died in a ballroom 3 years ago, leaving behind only this careful, quiet creature who expected nothing and therefore could not be disappointed. The morning arrived with pale spring sunlight struggling through clouds that seemed reluctant to release their hold on the grey sky, and Eleanor sat across from her mother in the sitting-room, where they had spent so many hours pretending that careful economy was merely sensible rather than desperate, when the post arrived bearing a letter that made Lady Henrietta's face go still, in a way that told Eleanor everything before a word was spoken. The creditors had lost patience, the final grace period had expired, and they would need to vacate the townhouse within the month unless the debts could be settled, which they could not, which meant a single rented room in some unfashionable corner of the city where no one would know them, where Eleanor might seek employment as a governess and complete her transformation from ruined debutante to invisible spinster, a fate she had contemplated in the dark hours of sleepless nights, but never spoken aloud because speaking it would make it real. She was composing words of hollow comfort for her mother when the maid appeared in the doorway, her expression caught between confusion and something approaching awe, announcing that His Grace the Duke of Thornton had called and was waiting in the entrance hall. And for a moment, Eleanor was certain she had misheard, because the Duke of Thornton did not call upon families in reduced circumstances in unfashionable neighborhoods. The Duke of Thornton was a figure glimpsed across crowded ballrooms, spoken of in whispers, known throughout society as cold and proud and impossibly wealthy and determinedly unmarried, despite being perhaps the most eligible bachelor in all of England. But then he was there, filling their modest sitting room with his presence in a way that made the worn carpet and faded drapes seem shabbier still, and Eleanor found herself staring at a man she had never truly looked at before, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to command, his dark eyes revealing nothing as they swept the room before settling on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His hair was dark, nearly black, and his features were stern rather than handsome, the face of a man who did not smile often or easily, and when he moved past her to bow over her mother's hand, she caught an unexpected scent, sandalwood and cedar with an undertone of leather, warm and masculine, and somehow at odds with his cold reputation. The pleasantries were brief and formal, his voice a deep baritone that he kept carefully controlled, each word clipped and precise, and then he was asking to speak with Eleanor alone, and her mother was hesitating, glancing between them with an expression Eleanor could not read, before withdrawing with a murmured excuse that fooled no one. In the silence that followed, Eleanor became acutely aware of his hands, large and capable, with long fingers, held very still at his sides, as if he were controlling himself carefully, and she noticed a thin scar crossing his right palm before he spoke with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. "I find myself in need of a wife, Miss Ashworth, and you find yourself in need of security. I believe we might solve each other's difficulties." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and practical all at once, and Eleanor's fingers rose without thought to touch the hollow of her throat, where her pulse beat too fast, her mind racing through every reason this could not be real, every memory of another man who had seemed to offer salvation before revealing himself as her destruction. And she thought of the promise she had made to herself in the aftermath of that ballroom humiliation. "I shall not hope. I shall not dream. I shall be grateful for safety and ask for nothing more. Hope is what destroys, and I shall not be destroyed again," even as some treacherous part of her heart whispered that perhaps, this stern and silent duke might be something other than what he appeared. She stood in the silence he had left behind, the echo of his words settling into the worn carpet and faded drapes like dust motes caught in the pale spring light, and Eleanor found herself unable to move, unable to think beyond the impossible weight of what had just occurred. A duke had stood in her mother's sitting room and offered her salvation wrapped in the cold language of practicality, and now she must decide whether to accept a future she had never dared imagine from a man whose dark eyes revealed nothing of his true intentions. "Why me?" she had asked him, her voice steadier than she felt, her fingers pressed against the hollow of her throat where her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird, and his answer had been delivered with that same careful precision that seemed to characterize everything about him. "You are intelligent, dignified, and unlikely to develop romantic expectations. I find those qualities appealing." The words should have stung, unlikely to develop romantic expectations, as though her capacity for love had been so thoroughly destroyed that it now recommended her as a suitable wife. And yet, There had been something in the way he paused before speaking, something in the way his thumb moved, almost imperceptibly, across the scar on his palm, that made her wonder if the words he spoke were not quite the words he meant. Her mother returned after he departed, her face a careful study in maternal concern and barely concealed hope, and Eleanor could not bear to discuss it, could not bear to see her own desperate circumstances reflected in her mother's worn hands and the new lines around her eyes. So she retreated to her small bedroom, where the evening light was already fading to grey, and the single candle she lit cast shadows that seemed to press in from every corner. She sat on the narrow bed that had been hers since childhood, and drew her grandmother's locket from beneath her bodice, the gold warm from her skin, and she opened it to gaze at the tiny portrait within. Her grandmother's kind eyes, her gentle smile, the face of a woman who had loved Eleanor without condition or calculation, who had told her stories of true love and happy endings that seemed now like fairy tales told to credulous children. "I give you my word, Miss Ashworth," he had said, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame, his voice dropping to something lower and more weighted than before. "I shall never give you cause to regret this arrangement. You will want for nothing. You will be treated with respect. I ask nothing of you that you are unwilling to give." The formality of the vow struck her, the almost ceremonial quality of each word, as though he were making a promise not merely to her, but to something larger, something that mattered to him in ways she could not yet understand. She thought of the creditor's letter, of the single rented room that awaited them, of her mother's cheerful voice discussing coal rations as though their world were not crumbling around them, and she thought of Clarence's cruel laughter echoing through 3 years of sleepless nights. And she made her decision with the locket pressed between her palms like a prayer. She would accept, not for love, never for love, but for survival, for her mother, for the quiet dignity of a life that did not require her to become invisible. She renewed her promise to herself, the words forming silently in the gathering darkness. "I shall not hope, I shall not dream. I shall be grateful for safety and ask for nothing more. Hope is what destroys, and I shall not be destroyed again." But even as she made the vow, something treacherous stirred beneath her careful resignation, something that remembered the unexpected warmth of sandalwood and cedar, the way his eyes had searched her face as though looking for something he could not name, and she pressed her fingers harder against the locket until the edges bit into her skin, willing herself to feel nothing, to expect nothing, to accept this arrangement for exactly what he had offered, a practical solution to practical problems, nothing more, nothing less, nothing that could ever touch the frozen place where her heart had once believed in love. The wedding was brief and formal, held in a small London church, where pale light filtered through stained glass windows and fell upon the worn stone floor like fragments of coloured dreams. And Eleanor stood in her best dress, a soft grey silk that had been fashionable 3 years ago, before everything changed, before she learned that love could be measured in pounds and found wanting, and spoke vows that felt like words from someone else's life, promises of devotion and fidelity made to a man whose dark eyes revealed nothing, as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size. And when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Eleanor Ashworth became Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Thornton, a title that sat upon her shoulders like a garment made for someone else entirely. Her mother wept quietly in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had been mended twice. And Eleanor felt a complicated surge of emotion, gratitude and grief, and something else she could not name, as Henry handed her into the waiting carriage with that same unexpected gentleness, his fingers brushing her elbow in a touch so brief she might have imagined it. The journey to Thornton Abbey took several hours, and they sat in silence for the first mile. The only sound the steady rhythm of hooves on cobblestones and then on country roads, until Eleanor gathered her courage and asked about the estate, her voice carefully measured to hide the tremor beneath. He answered readily enough, describing the grounds, the tenant farms, the house that had been in his family for 7 generations. And then, to her surprise, he began asking questions of his own. Did she ride? Did she enjoy gardens? What were her preferred pastimes? "I find great comfort in reading," she admitted, and something flickered in his expression, there and gone before she could name it. "The library at Thornton Abbey contains over 10,000 volumes," he said, his voice carrying an undertone she could not quite decipher. "I believe you will find it adequate." She mentioned, almost without thinking, that she had developed a fondness for Earl Grey tea during the years of careful economy when small pleasures became precious, and he made a sound that might have been acknowledgment, his thumb moving absently across the scar on his palm. When the carriage crested the final hill and Thornton Abbey came into view, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The house was magnificent, a sprawling edifice of honey-coloured stone that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, with formal gardens stretching before it and ancient oaks standing sentinel along the drive. And she understood for the first time the true magnitude of what she had become, the impossible distance between the shabby sitting-room where she had accepted his proposal and this palace that was now, impossibly, her home. The staff was lined up to greet. By them, footmen in livery, maids in crisp aprons, and at their head a dignified butler whose silver hair and kind eyes suggested decades of service, and Thomas Shepherd, as Henry introduced him, bowed over her hand with a warmth that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. Later, after she had been shown to her chambers and had changed from her travelling clothes, Eleanor wandered into the gardens as dusk began to fall, needing air and solitude to process the enormity of the day, and she was walking along a stone path still slick from an afternoon rain, when her foot slipped on the wet surface and she stumbled forward with a small cry of alarm. His hand caught her elbow before she could fall, warm and strong and startlingly close, and she looked up to find Henry standing beside her, his dark eyes unreadable in the fading light, and neither of them moved for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. His grip gentled, but he did not release her, and she became acutely aware of his scent. Sandalwood and cedar with an undertone of leather, warm and masculine, and unexpectedly comforting. And something flickered in his expression, something she could not name, but that made her heart beat faster in her chest. "Are you well, Your Grace?" he asked, and his voice was lower than before, rougher somehow, and Eleanor felt warmth spreading from where his hand still rested on her arm. "I am not yet accustomed to that title," she managed, and he paused, his thumb moving almost imperceptibly against the fabric of her sleeve before he finally released her. "You will need to become accustomed to it," he said, and there was something in his voice, not coldness, not the clipped formality she had expected, but something else entirely. And as she watched him walk back toward the house, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the amber light spilling from the windows, Eleanor touched the hollow of her throat, where her pulse beat too fast, and reminded herself of her promise. She would not hope, she would not dream, she would be grateful for safety, and ask for nothing more. The library at Thornton Abbey was everything he had promised and more. A vast cathedral of books rising 2 stories high with galleries of dark mahogany and windows that stretched toward the heavens. And Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway on her 3rd morning as Duchess, breathless with a wonder she had not permitted herself to feel in 3 long years, her grey-green eyes moving across the leather spines and gilt lettering, as though she had stumbled into a dream she dared not trust. She explored slowly, reverently, trailing her fingers along the shelves as she walked deeper into the room, past histories and philosophies and novels in French and Italian and languages she could not name, until she discovered the window seat tucked into an alcove overlooking the garden. A deep, cushioned space, bathed in morning light, where one might curl up with a book and forget, for a few precious hours, that the world beyond these walls had ever been cruel. It was there, nestled among the cushions with her slippers tucked beneath her, and her grandmother's locket warm against her skin, that she found a worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, its leather cover soft with age and use, and she opened it almost without thinking, to find the pages falling naturally to Sonnet 116, as though countless hands before hers had sought this same passage. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. The words blurred before her eyes, and she thought of Clarence, of how swiftly his devotion had altered when her circumstances changed, of how easily he had removed himself when there was nothing left to gain, and she pressed her fingers to the hollow of her throat and reminded herself that she would not hope, would not dream, would only be grateful for safety. But the words felt hollow now, worn thin by the small kindnesses she could not explain. That morning at breakfast, a cup of Earl Grey tea had appeared at her place without her requesting it, the steam rising fragrant and familiar, and when she looked up in surprise, Henry had merely turned a page of his correspondence, as though he had noticed nothing at all, though she could have sworn she saw his thumb move across the scar on his palm. Her sitting-room fire was always lit before she arrived, the temperature perfect, her favourite chair positioned near the window, where the light was best for reading, and her chambers had been furnished with such quiet elegance, soft greens and creams that soothed rather than overwhelmed, that she sometimes wondered if someone had looked into her heart and decorated accordingly. She did not dare ask if these were standing orders or specific attention, afraid of the answer either way. The dinner party came at the end of that first week, a small gathering of local society to introduce the new Duchess, and Eleanor dressed in one of the gowns Henry had provided, a deep green silk that made her eyes luminous, with trembling hands and a heart that beat too fast, terrified that she would be found wanting, that the whispers would begin again, that someone would see through the title to the desperate girl beneath. But Henry stayed near her throughout the evening, a solid presence at her shoulder, and she noticed, could not help but notice, that he angled his body toward her whenever anyone approached, positioning himself slightly behind and beside her in a way that felt protective without being possessive, and when Lady Beatrice Wentworth, a sharp-tongued society matron with knowing eyes, leaned toward her companion and remarked in a carrying whisper, "Mark my words, that girl will have Thornton wrapped around her finger within 6 months. He looks at her when she isn't watching, and I have never seen such an expression on that stone face. He does not know it yet, but he is already lost." Eleanor told herself it was absurd, impossible, the fancy of a romantic old woman, but the words lodged in her heart like a splinter. And later, alone in her magnificent chambers, she pressed her hand to her chest and felt something dangerous stirring beneath her careful resignation, something that felt terribly, treacherously like hope. The second week of her marriage brought Eleanor into corners of Thornton Abbey she had not yet explored, and when Henry suggested she accompany him on his rounds to the tenant farms, she agreed with a curiosity she could not quite suppress, telling herself it was merely practical. A duchess should know the estate she now nominally presided over, though in truth she found herself increasingly eager for any excuse to observe this enigmatic man who had become her husband, this duke whose stern exterior she was beginning to suspect concealed depths she had not imagined. They rode out on a morning soft with late spring warmth, the sky a tender blue scattered with clouds like lamb's wool, and Eleanor sat beside him in the open carriage as they wound through lanes bordered by hedgerows thick with hawthorn blossom. the sweet scent drifting on air that carried also the earthier notes of turned soil and growing things. And she watched him from the corner of her eye as he pointed out boundaries and explained the rotation of crops with a knowledge that surprised her. She had expected a duke to delegate such matters entirely, to view his tenants as mere sources of income rather than people whose lives depended upon his decisions. At the first farm, she watched him dismount and greet the farmer, a weathered man named James Barton, with a handshake that spoke of respect rather than condescension, and she listened as Henry asked after the man's wife, who had been ill through the winter, and promised that the physician would call again before the week was out, the cost to be borne by the estate as it always was. At the second farm, he inspected a roof that needed repair and made notes in a small leather book he carried in his coat pocket, his handwriting neat and decisive, and the tenant's wife pressed fresh bread and butter upon them both with a warmth that suggested this was not the cold and distant landlord Eleanor had been led to expect by society's whispers. But it was at the third farm that something shifted irrevocably in Eleanor's understanding. For as they approached the cottage, a small girl of perhaps 4 or 5 years darted behind her mother's skirts, peering out with wide, frightened eyes at the tall figure of the Duke, and Eleanor heard the child whisper, "Mamma, I'm scared of the great Duke," in a voice that trembled with genuine fear. She expected Henry to ignore the child, or perhaps to offer a stiff, formal greeting that would only confirm the little one's terror. But instead, he did something that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. He knelt, right there in the dust of the farmyard, bringing himself to the child's level, and his stern face softened into something almost tender as he spoke in a voice gentler than Eleanor had ever heard him use. "And what is your name, little one?" he asked. And when the girl whispered, "Lily," from behind her mother's protection, he nodded solemnly and said, "That is a very fine name, Lily, and I wonder if you might help me with a problem. You see, I have this peppermint in my pocket, and I cannot possibly eat it myself, and I thought perhaps you might know someone who would like it." He produced the sweet from his coat with a conspiratorial smile that transformed his countenance entirely, and Lily giggled, actually giggled, and crept forward to take it from his outstretched palm, and Eleanor stood frozen, her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest, because this was not the cold Duke the world believed him to be. This was something else entirely, something warm and hidden, and achingly tender. He caught her watching as he rose, and for just a moment his expression flickered with something like embarrassment, before the familiar reserve slid back into place, and Eleanor looked away quickly, but she could not unsee what she had witnessed, could not unknow this truth about the man she had married. That evening, after dinner had been cleared, and they sat in the drawing-room in what had become their customary companionable silence, Eleanor ventured to speak of what she had observed, thanking him for showing her the estate, for helping her understand her new role, and he seemed surprised by her gratitude, as though kindness was something to be hidden rather than acknowledged. She asked, almost without meaning to, about the peppermints. Did he always carry them? Was it a habit of long standing? And he was quiet for a long moment, his thumb moving across the scar on his palm, in that gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of deep thought or suppressed emotion. "My mother used to give them to me when I was frightened," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, rougher somehow, as though the words cost him something to speak. "Children should not fear the people meant to protect them." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother, and Eleanor filed the revelation away carefully, sensing that a door had been briefly opened, a glimpse offered into the heart he guarded so carefully, and as she lay in her bed that night, watching moonlight trace patterns on the ceiling, She touched the hollow of her throat and admitted to herself that her feelings toward this man were changing in ways she had promised herself she would not allow, that the warmth spreading through her chest when she remembered him kneeling in the dust to comfort a frightened child was something far more dangerous than gratitude, and she did not know whether to be terrified or glad. The rain came down in sheets that 4th week of her marriage, a summer storm that rattled the windows of Thornton Abbey and turned the world beyond the glass into a watercolour of grey and green, and Eleanor found herself curled in her beloved window seat in the library, with the worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets open in her lap, though her eyes kept drifting from the page to watch the rivulets chase each other down the panes, her thoughts wandering to places she had forbidden them to go, to the way Henry's voice had dropped when he spoke of his mother, to the peppermints he carried in his pocket like talismans against childhood fears, to the gentle strength of his hand when he had caught her elbow in the garden and held her steady as though she were something precious rather than merely clumsy. She heard him enter before she saw him, the familiar weight of his footsteps on the library's polished floors, and she looked up to find him standing in the doorway with a sheaf of estate papers in his hand, and something almost hesitant in his expression, as though he were uncertain of his welcome in this space that had become so entirely hers. "I thought I might work here," he said, his voice carrying that careful neutrality she was learning to see through, "if I would not disturb you." And she shook her head and gestured to the leather chair near the fire, watching as he settled into it with his papers, and for a long while they existed in companionable silence, broken only by the percussion of rain against glass and the occasional crack of thunder rolling across the hills. And Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him over the top of her book, noticing how the firelight caught the amber flecks in his dark eyes, how his brow furrowed slightly when he concentrated, how his thumb moved absently across the scar on his palm as he read. It was Thomas Shepherd who interrupted them, bringing tea and the morning's post, and among the letters was one from a society acquaintance that contained a clipping from a London gossip column, and Eleanor read it with growing incredulity before a sound escaped her that was half laugh and half disbelief, drawing Henry's attention from his papers. "Listen to this," she said, and read aloud the breathless account of Lady Hartwell's new bonnet, which the columnist described as a triumph of millinery genius, a veritable Waterloo of ribbon and silk, before which all other headwear must surely surrender in abject defeat. And she added, her voice dry as autumn leaves, "One wonders if the hat required its own carriage, or if it merely commandeered a cavalry regiment for the journey to the Modiste." The sound that escaped Henry was so unexpected that Eleanor's head snapped up, a laugh, genuine and unguarded, transforming his stern face into something younger and warmer and almost breathtakingly handsome, the lines around his eyes crinkling with mirth, his shoulders shaking with it, and she stared at him as though seeing him for the first time, her heart doing something complicated and wonderful in her chest, because she had never seen him smile, let alone laugh, and it changed. Everything about his countenance made him human and approachable and achingly beautiful, in a way his cold handsomeness had never been. The laughter faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt different than before, charged somehow, electric as the storm outside, and he caught her staring and held her gaze for a long moment before asking, his voice lower than usual, "What are you reading, when you are not cataloguing the military victories of London bonnets?" She showed him the sonnets, and something flickered in his dark eyes, and he quoted softly, almost to himself, as though the words escaped without his permission. "For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings." And Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and he looked away quickly, the mask sliding back into place. But she had seen it, had seen him, and as the thunder rolled overhead and the rain continued its assault upon the windows, she pressed her hand to her grandmother's locket, and felt something crack open in her chest, something that felt terribly, wonderfully, like the hope she had sworn never to feel again. The 5th week of her marriage brought a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, delivered to Eleanor's sitting room on a morning when summer had finally declared itself in earnest, the gardens beyond her window blazing with colour, and the air sweet with the scent of roses, climbing the ancient stone walls of Thornton Abbey, and she opened it with curiosity that turned to wonder as the paper fell away to reveal a book. Not merely any book, but a first edition of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, the very volume she had mentioned once, weeks ago, in passing conversation during that long carriage ride from London, when she had spoken of her father's library before the ruin and the treasures it had contained, never imagining that anyone was truly listening, never dreaming that her idle words would be remembered and acted upon with such quiet deliberation. The leather binding was supple beneath her fingers, the gilt edges catching the morning light, and when she opened the cover the smell of old paper and possibility rose to meet her, and she pressed the book to her chest as if it were something infinitely precious, which indeed it was, not for its monetary value, though that was considerable, but for what it represented, for the attention it revealed, for the proof that he had been listening, had been paying attention, had cared enough to remember a single wistful comment, and transform it into this tangible gift. She found him in his study, surrounded by estate papers and correspondence, and he looked up at her entrance with that slight lift of his dark brows that she was learning to read as surprise, and she held up the book with hands that were not quite steady and said, "You remembered?" And he rose from his chair with that unconscious grace of his, tall and broad-shouldered in the morning light, and his response was delivered in that clipped, dismissive tone she now recognized as his defense against any acknowledgment of his own kindness. "It was a small matter. You mentioned you had never seen a first edition, and now you have. It seemed logical." But there was something in his dark eyes that belied the casual words, something that made her heart turn over in her chest, and she thanked him with a formality that felt inadequate to the gift, retreating to her sitting room to hold the book against her heart, and wonder at the man who gave such gifts, and then pretended they meant nothing. The letter from her mother arrived that same afternoon, written in Lady Henrietta's familiar, elegant hand, full of news and warmth, and one particular detail that stopped Eleanor's breath in her throat. The creditors had been paid, every last one of them, the townhouse saved, her mother's comfort secured, and though the letter did not say who had arranged this miracle, Eleanor knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like sunlight, that Henry had done this quietly, without telling her, expecting nothing in return, asking for no gratitude. She sat alone that evening in her sitting room, the Wordsworth open in her lap, though she could not read a single line, and she admitted to herself what she had been fighting for weeks, that she was not merely grateful, not merely comfortable, not merely fond, but that something warmer and more dangerous was blooming in her chest, like the white camellias in the greenhouse, something that felt terrifyingly like love. And she thought of her promise not to hope, her vow never to dream, and she realized with a kind of helpless wonder that she was breaking it, had been breaking it for weeks, and she could not seem to stop, did not want to stop, even though the terror of hoping again, of wanting again, of loving again, made her press her fingers to the hollow of her throat as if to hold her heart inside her chest. The 6th week of her marriage found Eleanor wandering the moonlit corridors of Thornton Abbey in the small hours of the morning, her silk wrapper drawn close against the chill that seemed to seep from the ancient stones, her feet carrying her through halls she was only beginning to know while her mind churned with thoughts she could no longer contain, the Wordsworth on her nightstand, the letter from her mother, the quiet devastation of realizing that her careful walls had crumbled without her permission and left her heart exposed and trembling in the aftermath. And she found herself drawn to the portrait gallery as if by some invisible thread, that long corridor where generations of Ashfords gazed down from gilt frames with dark eyes that reminded her, always, of him. The moonlight streamed through the tall windows in silver rivers, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stillness, and she walked slowly past the faces of his ancestors, stern men and elegant women, children in stiff, formal dress, hunting dogs and horses, and the grand facades of estates, until she reached the far end of the gallery and stopped, her breath catching in her throat, because she was not alone. Henry stood before a portrait she had not yet examined closely, his back to her, his shoulders held with none of their usual rigid control, but instead curved inward as if bearing some invisible weight, and even in the dim silver light she could see that his guard was entirely, devastatingly down. Grief etched into every line of his posture, one hand raised as if he might touch the painted face before him, and Eleanor knew she should retreat, should leave him to this private moment of sorrow. But something held her feet to the cold floor, something that whispered she was meant to witness this, meant to understand. The portrait showed a woman of perhaps 30 years, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with Henry's own features softened into feminine beauty, her expression gentle and slightly sad, as if even the artist had captured some essential melancholy that lived beneath her gracious smile. And Eleanor knew, without being told, that this was his mother, the woman who had given him peppermints when he was frightened, who had died when he was 12 and left him alone with a father who viewed affection as weakness. He must have sensed her presence, for he turned, and the expression on his face in that unguarded moment stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs, raw grief and loneliness, and something that looked terribly like fear, all of it visible for one heartbeat before the mask began to slide back into place, his jaw tightening, his shoulders straightening, the walls rebuilding themselves brick by brick. "I could not sleep," Eleanor said softly, stepping closer rather than retreating, and she watched him struggle with the impulse to dismiss her, to deflect, to hide behind formality and distance. "She was beautiful," Eleanor continued, her voice gentle in the moonlit silence. "Your mother, she has your eyes, or rather you have hers." He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer, but then his voice came, low and rough with suppressed feeling. "She died when I was 12. I believe her heart simply gave out, though the physicians spoke of fever and weakness. But I knew even then that my father had broken something essential in her, had crushed the warmth out of her with his coldness, until there was nothing left to sustain her." Eleanor moved closer still, close enough to see the muscle flexing near his temple as he fought for control, and she asked quietly, "Is that what you fear, becoming him?" The sound he made was not quite a laugh, bitter and broken at the edges, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I fear I am my father's son, that I am incapable of warmth, that the coldness is not armor, but truth, that I will destroy anyone foolish enough to care for me, as surely as he destroyed her." The words hung in the moonlit air between them, and Eleanor's heart broke for him, for the boy who had watched his mother fade, for the man who had armored himself so thoroughly against feeling that he had come to believe the armor was his skin. And she spoke without thinking, the words rising from somewhere deep and true. "A man incapable of warmth does not kneel in the mud to comfort a frightened child, does not carry peppermints in his pocket like talismans against old fears, does not remember which books a woman mentioned once in passing and move heaven and earth to place them in her hands." He stared at her as if she had said something extraordinary, his dark eyes wide in the moonlight, and Eleanor held his gaze and did not look away. The morning after the portrait gallery brought with it a quality of light that seemed different to Eleanor, softer somehow, as if the world itself had shifted in the small hours when she had stood before his mother's portrait and spoken words that made him look at her as though she had offered him something precious beyond measure, and when she descended to breakfast she found him already there, which was unusual. He typically rose earlier and ate alone before attending to estate business, but today he stood at the sideboard as if waiting, and when she entered his dark eyes found hers immediately with an expression she could not quite name, something tentative and searching that made her heart stutter in her chest. "I thought we might breakfast together," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, rougher at the edges. "If you are amenable." And Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest at this simple offering, this small gesture that spoke of a desire for her company that had nothing to do with duty or arrangement, and she smiled, that surprised smile that tilted her head slightly to the left, and said she would like that very much. They spoke of small things at first, the weather and the estate, and the progress of repairs to a tenant cottage, but the conversation wound its way toward more personal waters, and she found herself asking about his mother's favourite flower, the question rising unbidden from the intimacy they had shared the night before, and he paused with his teacup halfway to his lips before answering quietly that it had been the white rose, that his mother had kept a garden of them beneath her sitting-room window, that he could still remember the scent of them drifting through the open casements on summer evenings. She said they reminded her of hope, he added, and his voice caught slightly on the word, and Eleanor understood that he was offering her another piece of himself, another fragment of the heart he kept so carefully guarded, and she received it with the tenderness it deserved. Later that morning, Eleanor found herself in the greenhouse with Mr. Reed, the head gardener, a weathered man with kind eyes and soil permanently embedded beneath his fingernails, and she wandered among the exotic blooms while he explained the particular requirements of each species, until she came upon a cluster of white camellias in full flower, their petals like cream silk, their fragrance delicate and achingly familiar. "These were my grandmother's favourite," she said softly, reaching out to touch one perfect bloom, white camellias. "She taught me their meaning in the language of flowers when I was a girl, and I have loved them ever since." Mr. Reed asked what they signified, and Eleanor smiled, her fingers gentle on the petals as she replied, "Perfect love, devotion, a longing that remains constant." And she did not see the shadow that fell across the greenhouse doorway, did not hear the soft intake of breath or the quiet retreat of footsteps on gravel, did not know that Henry had followed her and stood listening with an expression that would have stolen her breath had she witnessed it. That evening in the library, he handed her a book he thought she might enjoy, and their fingers brushed in the exchange, and the touch was electric, a current that ran through Eleanor's entire body and left her trembling. And she saw him freeze as well, his dark eyes dropping to where their hands had touched, and for one endless moment neither of them moved, neither breathed, the air between them charged with something that felt inevitable and terrifying and wonderful all at once. She excused herself early, pleading tiredness, and fled to her room, where she pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks and admitted to herself, with a kind of helpless surrender, that she wanted more than companionship, more than respect, more than the careful arrangement they had agreed upon. She wanted him, wanted his hands and his mouth and his heart, wanted to be held and cherished and loved. And she had no idea, none at all, whether he felt anything beyond the duty he had promised her. The 8th week of her marriage brought Eleanor to the threshold of Lord and Lady Hamilton's summer ball, and she stood in her dressing-room at Thornton Abbey while her maid fastened the last of the pearl buttons along her spine, watching her reflection in the gilt-framed mirror with something between wonder and terror. The woman who gazed back at her wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that seemed to catch the candlelight and hold it captive, her chestnut hair swept into an elegant arrangement that revealed the graceful line of her neck, and upon her finger gleamed the grey-green tourmaline ring Henry had given her 3 weeks prior, pressing it into her palm with characteristic brevity, and the words, "I thought it might suit you," as if he had not chosen a stone the precise colour of her eyes in morning light, as if the ring were not a declaration he could not bring himself to speak aloud. She touched the hollow of her throat with trembling fingertips, that familiar gesture of anxiety, and reminded herself that she was no longer Miss Eleanor Ashworth, ruined daughter of a bankrupt family, but the Duchess of Thornton, wife to one of the most powerful men in England. And yet the prospect of facing the ton that had witnessed her humiliation 3 years ago sent ice through her veins despite the warmth of the summer evening. Henry was waiting for her at the foot of the grand staircase when she descended, and something flickered in his dark eyes as he watched her approach, something that made her breath catch and her heart stutter against her ribs, before his expression smoothed into its familiar composure, though she thought she detected a softening at the corners of his mouth that had not been there in the early weeks of their marriage. "You look—" he began, then paused, and the muscle near his temple flexed, as if he were restraining words that wished to escape. "You look very well, Your Grace." And though the compliment was restrained, the roughness in his voice suggested depths he would not permit himself to voice. He offered his arm with quiet steadiness, and she took it, acutely aware of the warmth of him through the fine wool of his coat, the familiar scent of sandalwood and cedar that had become synonymous with safety in her mind. And he said in that low voice he used only with her, "You are the Duchess of Thornton, and you have nothing to prove to anyone. If anyone dares to treat you with less than complete respect, they will answer to me." The Hamilton estate blazed with light as their carriage approached, hundreds of candles glittering through tall windows like earthbound stars, and Eleanor's fingers tightened on Henry's arm as they entered the ballroom, a vast expanse of polished marble and gilt mirrors, filled with the cream of society in their silks and jewels, the orchestra playing a waltz that seemed to mock her thundering pulse. She managed well at first, Henry a solid presence at her side as they greeted their hosts and exchanged pleasantries with neighbouring families, and she felt herself beginning to breathe more easily, beginning to believe she might survive this evening unscathed until she saw him, and the breath froze in her lungs like winter ice. Lord Clarence Pemberton stood across the ballroom with Lady Augusta on his arm, and Eleanor noted with distant clarity that 3 years had not been kind to him. His golden hair had thinned, his handsome features had sharpened into something pinched and petulant, and his pale blue eyes held none of the warmth she had once foolishly believed she saw there. Augusta looked beautiful and bitter in crimson silk, her expression one of barely concealed contempt as she surveyed the gathering, and when Clarence's calculating gaze found Eleanor across the crowded room, she watched recognition dawn in his eyes, followed by surprise, and then something that made her stomach clench with dread, a slow, cruel smile that she remembered all too well. He began to make his way toward her, and Eleanor could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything but stand frozen as 3 years of carefully buried humiliation rose in her throat like bile, and she was dimly aware that Henry had been drawn away by their host to discuss some matter of local politics, that she stood alone and exposed as Clarence approached with that false smile curving his thin lips, his cloying cologne reaching her before his words did, sweet and heavy, and nothing like the clean warmth of sandalwood. "Why, Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests, "I beg your pardon. Your Grace, how unexpected to see you risen so high, one might almost think you had planned it." And Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, her anxiety tell, as the words struck her like blows, and she found herself utterly, devastatingly unable to speak. Clarence's voice carried just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests, his pale blue eyes glittering with the same cruel calculation she remembered from 3 years ago as he continued, "I must confess, I did not expect Thornton to go bargain hunting, but then I suppose even dukes must economize somewhere. Tell me, does he know about your family's difficulties, or did you manage to hide the stench of desperation?" And Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, felt the old humiliation rising in her throat like bile, her hand frozen at the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat wild and frantic, and she could not speak, could not move, could not do anything but stand there, as the whispers began to ripple outward through the watching guests, and she thought with a kind of distant horror that it was happening again, that she would be frozen in this moment forever, trapped in the amber of her own shame. And then she felt him before she saw him, felt the shift in the air, the sudden warmth at her side. And Henry was there, appearing as if conjured from the very shadows, his tall form positioning itself slightly in front of her in that protective stance she had come to know. And when he spoke, his voice was ice and iron, carrying clearly across the suddenly silent corner of the ballroom with a precision that made Clarence's face drain of colour. "Lord Pemberton, I believe you are addressing my wife." The temperature in that corner of the Hamilton ballroom seemed to drop by several degrees, and Eleanor watched as Henry's dark eyes fixed upon Clarence with an expression that made the other man take an involuntary step backward, and Henry continued, each word precise and devastating in its controlled fury. "I chose the Duchess of Thornton because she possesses qualities you could not recognize if they were explained to you in terms of a single syllable: intelligence, dignity, genuine worth. I understand such concepts may be foreign to a man who measures value only in pounds sterling, but let me be clear. If you speak to or of my wife with anything less than the utmost respect, I will ensure that every door in England closes to you, and I am a man of my word." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant strains of the orchestra playing on in blissful ignorance, and Eleanor watched as Clarence's handsome face twisted with impotent fury before he retreated, Augusta regarding her husband with such open contempt that Eleanor might have pitied him if she had possessed any pity left to give, and then Lady Beatrice Wentworth's voice carried clearly across the watching crowd. Well, that was immensely satisfying, and laughter rippled through the observers, laughter directed at Clarence, not at Eleanor, laughter that felt like vindication made audible. Henry's hand found hers then, warm and steady and grounding, his fingers interlacing with her own as if they belonged there, as if they had always belonged there, and he led her away from the whispers and the stares. And she realized she was shaking, not with fear, not with humiliation, but with something else entirely, something that felt like hope and terror and joy all tangled together in her chest. He had chosen her. He had defended her. In front of everyone, in front of the very society that had witnessed her disgrace, he had declared her worth with words that left no room for doubt, and when his dark eyes met hers, there was nothing cold in them at all. They were warm as honey in sunlight, burning with an intensity that stole her breath and made her heart stutter against her ribs, and she understood with sudden, devastating clarity that Lady Beatrice had been right all along. He was already lost, and so, heaven help her, was she. The carriage swayed through the darkness as they left the Hamilton estate behind, and Eleanor sat across from Henry in the velvet-cushioned interior, where the only light came from the carriage lamps casting flickering shadows across his angular features, and she could not stop looking at him, at the man who had stood before all of society and declared her worth in words that still echoed through her like the reverberations of a bell. And she found that her hands were trembling in her lap, that her voice, when she finally spoke, was unsteady with emotion she could no longer contain. "Thank you," she said, and the words seemed wholly inadequate for what he had done, for the way he had positioned himself between her and Clarence's cruelty, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if defending her honour was simply what one did. And Henry's dark eyes met hers across the swaying carriage, and she saw something flicker in their depths before he looked away, his jaw tightening in that familiar way that meant he was restraining strong feeling. "I merely stated facts," he said, but his voice was lower than usual, rougher, as if the words had to travel through something that constricted his throat, and Eleanor shook her head, pressing her fingers together to still their trembling, surrounded by the warm, masculine scent of sandalwood and cedar that filled the close quarters of the carriage, and made her think of safety, of home, of things she had promised herself she would never hope for again. "No one has ever defended me like that," she said quietly, and she watched his profile in the lamplight, watched the muscle flex near his temple, watched his hands, those large, capable hands with the thin scar across the right palm, clench briefly against his thighs before deliberately relaxing. And he was silent for so long that she thought he would not respond at all. But then his voice came, low and rough, and carrying an edge of something that sounded almost like anger. "No one should have needed to. You should never have been treated so poorly in the first place." And Eleanor's breath caught at the fierce protectiveness in his tone, at the way he spoke as if Clarence's cruelty 3 years ago was a personal affront to him, as if her pain was something he wished he could have prevented, and she did not know what to say, did not trust her voice, and so they rode in silence through the summer darkness until the lights of Thornton Abbey appeared through the carriage windows like a constellation of earth-bound stars. He handed her down from the carriage when they arrived, and their hands lingered, his fingers warm and strong around hers, neither of them moving to break the contact. And Eleanor looked up at him in the candlelight that spilled from the entrance hall, at his dark eyes that were not cold at all, but burning with something she was afraid to name, and the air between them felt charged like the atmosphere before a storm, heavy with words unspoken and feelings too large to contain. He seemed about to say something. His jaw worked. His eyes searched her face as if looking for an answer to a question he had not yet asked, and Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs, certain that something was about to happen, that everything was about to change. And then he stepped back, and the moment shattered like glass. "You should rest," he said, and his voice was carefully controlled again, carefully distant, though she thought she heard a tremor beneath the composure. "It has been an eventful evening," and before she could speak, before she could reach for him, he turned and retreated toward his study, leaving her standing alone in the entrance hall, with her heart pounding and her hands still warm from his touch. In her sitting room, Eleanor pressed her palms to her flushed cheeks and stared at her reflection in the darkened window, at the woman who looked back at her with grey-green eyes bright with unshed tears, and something that looked terrifyingly like hope. And she could no longer pretend. She loved him, loved his hidden tenderness and his fierce protection, and the warmth he concealed beneath that stern exterior, loved the way he remembered small things, and the way his laugh transformed his face, and the way he had stood before all of society and declared her worthy of respect. And she thought of his vow, of his promise to give her security and respect, and nothing she was unwilling to give, and she realized with devastating clarity that she was willing to give him everything, that she wanted everything, and she was utterly terrified because she had no idea if he felt anything beyond duty and honor, no idea if the warmth in his eyes was love, or merely the protectiveness he would show to anyone in his care. And she pressed her grandmother's locket against her heart, and whispered into the empty room, "I promised myself I would not hope, but heaven help me, I cannot seem to stop." The days that followed the Hamilton ball passed in a strange new rhythm that Eleanor could not quite name, a heightened awareness that seemed to charge the very air between them whenever they occupied the same room, and she found herself attuned to his presence in ways that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken. The sound of his boots in the corridor, the low murmur of his voice speaking with Thomas Shepherd in the entrance hall, the way he appeared at breakfast each morning now before she did, as if he had been waiting, as if her arrival was something he anticipated rather than merely noted. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, ranging from books to memories of childhood, to quiet observations about the gardens or the tenants, and yet beneath every word lay something unspoken, a current that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. And Eleanor caught him watching her when he thought she was absorbed in her reading, his dark eyes soft with something that made her heart stutter against her ribs, and she wondered if he caught her watching him in turn, cataloguing the way the morning light revealed the amber flecks in his eyes, or the way his hands moved when he turned pages, those large, capable hands with the thin scar across the right palm that she had come to know as well as her own. It was on the 4th day after the ball that Thomas Shepherd found her alone in the morning room, and the elderly butler approached with the quiet dignity that characterized his every movement, his weathered face holding an expression of careful consideration as he said, "If I may be so bold, Your Grace, I have served this family for 30 years, and I knew the late Duchess, His Grace's mother, quite well." And Eleanor set down her teacup, sensing that something significant was about to be shared, and Thomas continued, his voice soft with memory. "She brought warmth to this house before the old Duke crushed it out of her, and I have not seen the current Duke so alive in years as I have seen him these past weeks. The late Duchess had a saying, 'A house becomes a home when someone cares whether you return to it,' and I believe Her Grace cares very much indeed, and I believe His Grace knows it." The butler's words stayed with Eleanor throughout that day, turning over and over in her mind like stones polished by water. And when she returned to her sitting room that evening as the summer twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, she stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her throat in that gesture that had become so familiar, because there on the table by the window stood a vase of white camellias, perfect, fresh, their petals like carved ivory, and their scent filling the room with sweetness that made her eyes sting with sudden tears. There was no note, no card, nothing to indicate their origin, but Eleanor knew. She knew with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason who had sent them, and she crossed the room on trembling legs and touched the petals with fingers that shook, remembering the greenhouse, remembering her own voice explaining their meaning to the gardener, while unaware that Henry stood listening in the doorway. Perfect love, devotion, a longing that remains constant. He had heard her, and he had remembered, and he had sent her this message in the only language he seemed able to speak, the language of action, of attention, of gifts, that showed he had been listening to every word she said, and Eleanor pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks as the tears spilled over, because this was not duty. This was not the practical arrangement of a man fulfilling his obligations. This was something else entirely, something that looked and felt and smelled like love, and yet still he did not speak. Still he held himself back, and she did not know if he was afraid or uncertain, or simply waiting for something she had not yet given him. The storm had been building all day, dark clouds massing on the horizon like an army preparing for siege, and Eleanor found herself unable to settle anywhere in the great house that had become her home. She tried her sitting room, but the white camellias on the table made her heart ache with their silent message. Tried the morning room, but the windows faced away from the gardens where she knew he walked. And finally she made her way to the library, to the window seat that had become her sanctuary. But even there the worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets could not hold her attention, because the words blurred before her eyes as she thought of everything that had passed between them, and everything that remained unspoken, the camellias and his defence at the ball, and the way his hand had found hers, and the almost confession in the entrance hall that had shattered when he stepped back, and the oppressive heat of the summer afternoon pressed against her skin like a physical weight, while thunder rumbled in the distance, and she pressed her fingers to the hollow of her throat, in that gesture that had become so habitual, feeling her pulse flutter beneath her fingertips like a caged bird. And then she saw him through the rain-spattered glass, a tall, dark figure walking in the garden despite the threatening sky, his broad shoulders set in that way that meant he was wrestling with something he could not name. And before she could think, before she could stop herself, she was moving through the library and down the corridor and out through the garden door into air that smelled of rain and roses and the electricity of the coming storm. The first drops fell as she reached the gravel path, warm summer rain that spotted her muslin dress and loosened tendrils of chestnut hair from her chignon, and he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his dark eyes widening with surprise and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. "You should go inside," he said, his voice rough. "You will catch cold." But she did not move, could not move, because she was rooted to the spot by the intensity of his gaze and the way the rain was beginning to fall harder now, plastering his dark hair to his forehead and soaking through his coat, and still neither of them moved toward shelter. "You're shivering," he said, and his voice had dropped to that low register that made her skin prickle with awareness. And then he was shrugging out of his coat and stepping closer, so close she could smell sandalwood and cedar and rain-wet linen, and he draped the coat around her shoulders with hands that were not quite steady, and the warmth of the fabric carried his scent and the heat of his body, and she clutched it around herself like armor, even as she felt her defenses crumbling. "The camellias," she heard herself say, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "You remembered what they mean?" And his jaw tightened, that muscle flexing near his temple, and his dark eyes burned into hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "I remember everything you say," he replied, and his voice was rough, almost broken. "Every word, every preference, every small detail. I cannot seem to help myself." And the rain was falling in earnest now, thunder cracking overhead, but Eleanor could not look away from his face, from the vulnerability she saw breaking through his careful control, and she knew that they had reached the edge of something from which there would be no retreat. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before she could protest, and the warmth of it enveloped her like an embrace, carrying his scent of sandalwood and cedar and something that was simply him, and she clutched the lapels with fingers that trembled as the rain plastered her chestnut hair to her temples and ran in rivulets down her face, and he stood before her in his shirt-sleeves, the white linen already soaked through and clinging to the broad planes of his shoulders, and his dark eyes burned into hers with an intensity that stole what remained of her breath. "We should go inside," he said, but he did not move, and neither did she, and the thunder rolled overhead like a declaration as the storm broke fully around them, and Eleanor heard herself speak as if from a great distance, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "Why did you send them? The camellias. Why did you remember what they meant?" His jaw tightened, that familiar muscle flexing near his temple, and his hands clenched at his sides as if he were fighting some internal battle, and when he spoke his voice was rough, almost broken. "Because I find I cannot forget anything about you, not the way you tilt your head when you are pleased, not the books you love, not the flowers that remind you of someone who loved you well. I have tried to maintain the distance I promised, to ask nothing you were unwilling to give, but I find—" He stopped, his breath ragged, and his hand rose as if of its own accord to brush a rain-soaked tendril of hair from her cheek, his touch so gentle it made her heart crack open, and she saw in his eyes something she had never dared to hope for. Not duty, not honor, not the careful respect he had vowed, but something fierce and tender and terrifying in its depth. "I find I am not the man I believe myself to be," he continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I thought myself incapable of this, of feeling so much that it threatens to unmake me. I watched my mother love my father, and it destroyed her, and I swore I would never. But you, Eleanor," and it was the first time he had used her Christian name, and it fell from his lips like a prayer, like a confession, like something sacred. "You have undone every wall I built, and I do not know how to. I am not skilled at speaking of such things." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, brushing away rain or tears. She could not tell which, and Eleanor reached up and caught his hand, pressing it against her face, feeling the scar across his palm against her skin, and she said with a certainty that surprised her, "Then do not speak. Show me." And something in his expression shattered, the last of his careful control crumbling like a dam before a flood. And he pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her, as if she were something precious he feared to lose. And his mouth found hers in a kiss that tasted of rain and longing, and 3 years of buried hope finally set free. And the storm raged around them, but Eleanor felt only warmth, only safety, only the overwhelming rightness of being held by this man who had shown her in 1,000 small ways what he could not say in words. And when he finally lifted his head, his dark eyes were soft with wonder, amber flecks glowing even in the grey stormlight, and he whispered against her lips, "I love you. I think I have loved you since the moment you looked at me in your mother's sitting room with those grey-green eyes, and did not flinch from my coldness. I love you, and I am terrified, and I do not know how to do this, but I know I cannot bear another day of pretending I do not." Eleanor's confession came out in a rush, words she had held behind her teeth for weeks, finally breaking free like water through a dam. "I love you. I have tried not to. I promised myself I would not hope. I swore I would be grateful for safety and ask for nothing more. But I cannot seem to stop myself, and when you sent the camellias, I knew you must feel something. And when you defended me at the ball, I thought my heart would shatter with how much I wanted." But she could not finish, because his mouth found hers again, softer this time, tender and searching. And when he drew back, his dark eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, and his voice was rough as he said, "I have loved you since before I proposed, Eleanor. I watched you for months, saw how you carried yourself with dignity when society turned its back, saw how you cared for your mother without complaint, saw the quiet strength that Pemberton was too blind and too shallow to recognize. I told myself I was offering a practical arrangement because I was afraid, because my father's cruelty taught me that love was weakness, and I had armored myself against it for so long I did not know how to do otherwise. But from the moment you looked at me in your mother's sitting room, with those grey-green eyes, and did not flinch from my coldness, I was lost." The rain was beginning to ease now, the thunder rolling away toward the distant hills, and Eleanor became aware that they were both soaked through, his white shirt transparent against the broad plains of his chest, her muslin dress clinging to her in a manner that would have scandalized any observer. But there was no one to see them in the rain-washed garden, only the dripping roses and the clouds beginning to break apart overhead. And she laughed, actually laughed, that surprised sound she so rarely made, and tilted her head to the left as joy flooded through her, unexpected and overwhelming, and he stared at her as if she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You are shivering," he said again, but this time the words were tender, almost wondering, and he pulled her closer against the warmth of his body, his arms wrapping around her as if he would never let go, and she pressed her face against his chest and breathed in sandalwood and cedar and rain and him. And she thought of Sonnet 116, "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds," and knew at last what those words truly meant, because this man had chosen her when she had nothing, had seen her worth when the world declared her worthless, had loved her in actions long before he found the words, and as the first rays of sunlight broke through the dispersing clouds and painted the wet garden in gold, Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Thornton, finally allowed herself to hope without fear, to want without shame, to love without the shadow of old wounds. And when Henry lifted her face to his and kissed her again, with the sunlight streaming down around them like a benediction, she knew that this was the second moment that would define her life, the moment when hope dared to breathe again and found itself answered. The weeks that followed their rain-soaked confession in the garden unfolded like the petals of a flower opening to the sun, and Eleanor found herself living in a world transformed. Not the world itself, which remained the same elegant halls and rolling grounds of Thornton Abbey, but her experience of it, which had shifted from careful gratitude to something luminous and warm, a happiness so complete it sometimes frightened her with its intensity, as if she feared it might be snatched away as suddenly as it had arrived. Henry had changed too, or rather, he had stopped hiding the man he truly was. The stern mask he wore in company softened the moment they were alone, his dark eyes warming to honey when they rested on her, his voice dropping to that low, rough register that made her heart flutter against her ribs like a caged bird seeking freedom. They took breakfast together now, truly together. Their chairs moved closer than propriety strictly demanded, and he would reach across the table to touch her hand, as if he could not bear even the small distance between them, and she would watch the way the morning light caught the amber flecks in his eyes, and think that she had never known it was possible to feel so much for another person. The Ton's autumn ball at Lord and Lady Stratton's estate arrived on a crisp October evening, and Eleanor dressed with care in a gown of deep green silk that Henry had commissioned for her. "The colour of your eyes when you are happy," he had said when presenting it, and she had kissed him until they were both breathless. And when she descended the staircase to find him waiting in the entrance hall, resplendent in black evening clothes, the look on his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in England. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and crystal, and Eleanor was aware of the whispers that followed them as they entered. The Duke of Thornton and his unlikely Duchess, the woman society had declared ruined 3 years ago now, wearing emeralds at her throat and devotion in her husband's every glance. And she saw Lady Beatrice Wentworth watching them with undisguised satisfaction, the older woman's prediction from those early weeks proven true beyond any doubt. "They cannot stop staring," Eleanor murmured as Henry led her onto the dance floor, and he pulled her closer than was strictly proper for a waltz, his hand warm and steady at the small of her back, and replied with that rare smile that still had the power to steal her breath. "Let them stare. Let them see what I see when I look at you, though they could never truly understand it." She caught a glimpse of Clarence Pemberton across the room, his face pinched and bitter as he watched them, Augusta cold and distant at his side, and Eleanor felt no triumph, only a distant pity for a man who had measured love in pounds and found himself bankrupt in the only currency that mattered. "I love you," she whispered, as they turned across the polished floor, and Henry's arms tightened around her, his voice rough with emotion as he answered, "And I you, more than I knew it was possible to love anything." And Lady Beatrice's voice carried across to nearby guests with deliberate clarity. "Society declared Miss Ashworth ruined 3 years ago. How delicious that she should rise to become the most envied woman in England. The Ton does so love to be proven wrong, even when they pretend otherwise." The months that followed the Stratton ball unfolded in a golden haze of happiness that Eleanor sometimes had to remind herself was real, that this life of love and laughter and belonging was truly hers, and not some fever dream from which she would wake to find herself back in that cramped sitting-room with its careful economies and quiet desperation. And when the first signs came, the morning sickness that sent her rushing from the breakfast table, the bone-deep exhaustion that overtook her in the afternoons, the strange new tenderness in her body, she kept them to herself for a fortnight, hardly daring to believe, hardly daring to hope even now when hope had proven itself so gloriously justified, until the physician confirmed what she had suspected, and she found herself standing in the library at Thornton Abbey, in her beloved window-seat where she had first read Sonnet 116, and where Henry had later confessed his love, waiting for him to return from his morning ride with her hands pressed against her still flat belly, and her heart so full she thought it might overflow. He knew something was different the moment he entered the room. She saw it in the way his dark eyes sharpened, the way he crossed to her in 3 long strides, his riding coat still damp from the morning mist, his hands reaching for hers with that tender urgency that still had the power to steal her breath. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his mouth was a question and a prayer, and she took his hand, that large, capable hand with its thin scar across the palm, and pressed it gently against her abdomen, and watched as understanding dawned across his features, watched as the stern lines of his face transformed into something she had never seen before, a joy so profound and unguarded that it brought tears to her eyes. "You are certain?" he asked, his voice rough, barely above a whisper, and when she nodded he gathered her into his arms with such exquisite gentleness, as if she had become something precious and fragile, and she felt his shoulders shake with emotion as he held her. This man who had once believed himself incapable of warmth, this man who had feared becoming his cold and brutal father, now trembling with happiness at the prospect of becoming a father himself. "I was so afraid," she confessed against his chest, breathing in the beloved scent of sandalwood and cedar and leather. "Afraid that I would never have this, that I would never be chosen, never be loved, never hold my own child in my arms, and now—" But she could not finish, because he was kissing her, soft and reverent, and when he drew back his dark eyes were bright with tears. He did not try to hide. "You will be the most wonderful mother," he said, and his voice was that low, rough register that meant he was feeling too much to contain. "And I swear to you, Eleanor, I swear on everything I am, our child will never know a moment of coldness, will never doubt that they are loved, will never feel the weight of a father's cruelty. I will be everything my father was not. I will—" And now it was her turn to silence him with a kiss, to press her palm against his cheek, and tell him what she had known since that night in the portrait gallery, when he had confessed his deepest fear. "You already are, Henry. You already are." The years unfolded like the pages of a beloved book, each chapter richer than the last, and Eleanor often found herself pausing in the midst of ordinary moments, watching Henry teach their son William to ride his first pony across the sunlit meadows of Thornton Abbey, or holding their daughter Rose as the child traced the delicate petals of white camellias in the greenhouse with wondering fingers, to marvel at the distance between the woman she had been and the woman she had become, between the grey afternoon when she had sat in a shabby sitting room, telling herself she would never hope again, and this golden present, where hope had not destroyed her, but had instead delivered her into a happiness so complete it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. Henry had kept every promise he had ever made to her, and had given her so much more than he had vowed, not merely security and respect, but a love so fierce and tender it had transformed them both, softening his stern edges even as it had healed the wounds Clarence's cruelty had carved into her heart. And when she watched him now with their children, patient and gentle and endlessly devoted, she saw no trace of the cold father he had feared becoming, only a man who had learned that love was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. Lady Henrietta visited often, her practical warmth unchanged, even as her circumstances had improved beyond all imagining, and she would sit with Eleanor in the library, that beloved sanctuary with its window-seat where so much had begun, and speak of grandchildren and gardens, and the curious workings of fate that had brought them from desperation to such abundance. Thomas Shepherd still presided over the household with quiet dignity, and sometimes Eleanor caught him watching her and Henry with an expression of profound satisfaction, as if the house had finally become the home his late mistress had always wished it to be. Society had long since accepted what it could not deny, that the Duke of Thornton was utterly devoted to his Duchess, that the woman they had once pitied and dismissed had become the envy of every drawing-room in England, and Lady Beatrice Wentworth took every opportunity to remind anyone who would listen that she had predicted it all from the very beginning, As for Clarence Pemberton, Eleanor heard occasionally that his fortunes continued to decline, his cold marriage growing colder still, his creditors ever more insistent. But she found she could summon nothing but distant pity for a man who had never understood that love was the only currency that truly mattered. On an autumn evening much like the one when she had first arrived at Thornton Abbey as a nervous bride in an outdated dress, Eleanor stood at the window of the library watching Henry walk across the garden with William on his shoulders, and Rose toddling beside him clutching a white camellia. And she pressed her hand against the cool glass, and felt her grandmother's locket warm against her heart, and thought of Sonnet 116, love that bears it out even to the edge of doom, and knew with absolute certainty that she had found it, that improbable, impossible, perfect love that does not alter when it alteration finds, and that she would carry it with her, grateful and wondering and complete, for all the days of her life.